This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Good evening, everyone. You're all very welcome to our IIEA webinar on addressing the mental health implications of digital life. My name is Joyce O'Connor and I chair the digital group here at the IIEA. It's my great pleasure now to welcome our distinguished speaker this evening, Dr. Ravi Iyer, Director of the newly Centre for Ethical Leadership and Decision Making and Managing Director of the Psychology of Technology Institute at the University of Southern California. Ravi, you're very welcome, and we appreciate very much you being with us this evening. I know you've been traveling a lot around the US, from California to, I think, is it Indiana today? So we're delighted that you're stopping off via webinar in Dublin. So thank you very much for your time and your expertise. Ravi will have links to his slides on the chat, so you'll be able to download his slides and also any references that he makes during his presentation. So thank you very much for sharing that with us, Ravi. He will speak to us for around 20 to 25 minutes, and then I will go to the Q&A with you, our audience. And I look forward to receiving questions from you for Ravi through the Q&A function at the bottom of your slides. Please feel free to send in your questions or comments throughout the session, and I'll come to them once Ravi has completed his presentation. When asking questions, I'd really appreciate if you'd give your name and affiliation. Thank you very much for that. A reminder too that today's presentation and Q&A are on the record. Please join the IIEA discussion on Twitter using the handle @IIEA. Dr. Iyer's presentation today is very timely. We're all living more of our lives online. Children now, as Dr. Iyer has commented, have a phone-based childhood. I think that it really struck me when I read that, Ravi, when you said that. While modern digital technologies are extraordinary tools, companies understandably want to increase our usage of online products, but they impact the long-term health and well-being of our children, our young people and adults. And research clearly shows how specific design choices of platforms drive some of these specific harms, included unintended harmful contact, unintended harmful content, unintended time and excessive usage, and misuse of a person's data, images, and identity. So we see digital technologies have become part of the infrastructure of children's young people's daily lives. Ravi will reflect on the powerful impact of platforms, their digital products and services on children, and digital children's rights, as well as their parents and the general society. He will discuss these common experiences and how they can be facilitated by design choices of online platforms, and how these experiences can be measurably reduced both within companies and as civil society stakeholders. He will argue companies must find ways to design differently and better. Dr. Ravi said is director of the Nearly Centre for Ethical Leadership and Decision Making and managing director of the Psychology of Technology Institute in the University of California. Previously, he spent over 4.5 years leading data science research and product teams across Meta, and towards improving the impact of social media on both society and individuals. He's a PhD in social psychology from USC and has co-authored numerous articles on the psychology of values and well-being. He co-founded Ranker and works at the intersection of academia, civil society, and the technology industry. He currently advises the UK Office of Communications, the Anxious Generation team, as well as several other jurisdictions on how to improve societal impact of technology. His work centres then on how technology platforms influence human well-being and how design choices on can support healthier, more ethical digital environments. Ravi, we're really looking forward to your presentation.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm going to give me a second. I'm just going to share some slides, and it's a pleasure to be with you. Moment. Great. So yes, as mentioned, thank you for the warm welcome. My name is Ravi Iyer. I work at the University of Southern California Marshall School Neely Center, and today I'm going to talk about addressing the mental health implications of digital life. And so, I don't think I have to belabor the point that more and more of our lives are lived online. In one recent survey, about youth reported spending 5 hours a day on social media platforms. That means, there's some kids spending 2 hours a day, there's some kids spending 8 hours a day, there's some kids at the tail of the distribution spending, that will say that they're online almost constantly. And it's really not uncommon. And if you ask kids around you, you'll be surprised by how much time they say they spend online. So, but as harms go online, there are externalities that result, right? And so I'm going to talk today about unwanted harmful contact, people receiving messages from strangers, being contacted in ways that they don't want. I'm going to talk to you today about unwanted content, people seeing content that they're not ready for, that they don't want, and then usage of platforms, overusage of platforms. A lot of kids will say themselves that they are using these platforms too much, and that they could use our help in using them less, just like many adults would say the same thing, right? I'm going to illustrate how these harms differ by a platform, and that different platforms have different designs. All platforms are not harmful in the same way, and you can look at the design of some platforms. Why do some platforms have more harm than other platforms? And you can understand, well, some platforms allow you to say negative feedback to the platform and say things you don't want. Some of the platforms optimize more for engagement than they do for user value. Some of the platforms allow users to contact other users easier, and they actually recommend people that you should be chatting with. So a lot of these harms are facilitated by platform design, but there are lots of policies now that can address these harms. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of those policies, and I'll talk about how we can anticipate and regulate against, it's natural. Companies are going to do what companies do. They're going to want to try to get you to use products more. And, we're not saying that there are no benefits to these things, but there are, just like we do for cars and automobiles and food, there are regulations that stop companies from doing things that are sort of harmful to consumers, even as they can create benefits and create profits. So without further ado, let me talk a little bit about like unwanted content, contact and usage. And I'll use some industry research just to illustrate the scale of these harms. And, a lot of the numbers I'll show you are, between 10 and 50%. It's not most users are experiencing these harms, but it's a significant number of users who are experiencing these harms. And if you think about it, how many kids there are on these platforms, about half of kids in the United States are on Snap or on Instagram. And then, so on the left here, this is a survey from Meta. It's a bad experience survey, and they're asking teens as well as users who are 45 plus whether they've had an unwanted sexual advance in the last 7 days. And you'll see the number for 13 to 15-year-olds is 13%. So 13% of 13 to 15-year-olds in this study, which is a couple of years ago, it's what we have from Meta. It came out in one of the court cases. So we don't have more recent numbers as a result. But 13% of 13 to 15-year-olds reported unwanted sexual advance. And so if you figure half of kids are on Instagram, 13% of them in a 7-day period are receiving an unwanted sexual advance. That's millions of American kids, and obviously something that I think calls for action, right? You get similar numbers in other industry research. Snap publicly releases a survey about online interactions. This is over a 3-month period. Have you received unwanted contact? Have you, received unwanted attention, unwanted sexual attention? And, 35% of, and this is not just teens, this is, I think, includes some early 20 users. But again, it's roughly in the same magnitude, 10 to 50%, depending on the time period, depending exactly how you ask the question, will report these kinds of experiences. And these things differ by platform. So Thorn does these studies where they actually look at unwanted harmful contact across platforms and over time. So in the latest 2024 study, you can see that on Snapchat, 18% of young users, of minors, and 20% on Instagram are reporting having an online sexual interaction. You can see how they define that versus YouTube, where you only see 8%, right? And you may be like, well, of course, YouTube is a very different experience, and that's somewhat the point. That these platforms are designed very differently. Instagram and Snapchat have a lot more sort of attention-getting content. Their algorithms are optimized for that. There's a lot more, you access it when you're logged in, and they encourage interaction between users more, whereas YouTube is more of a passive content experience. And as a result, you get different kinds of risks that are there for kids. Okay, unwanted harmful content. Again, I'll cite some numbers from Meta's Beef survey, their internal study, and you'll see that 19% of 13 to 15-year-olds will report unwanted. And so this nudity line here that I circled, this is actually unwanted sexual content, unwanted sexually explicit content, right? So this is not something they're seeking out. This is something that they're getting, whether they like it or not. And you often find, the average age of in one study in the U.S. of pornography exposure was age 12. And so it's not like a 16-year-old boy looking for pornography online, which may be something we'd have difficulty solving on the internet these days. It's actually oftentimes a 10-year-old or 12-year-old who's encountering these things in an algorithmically driven way that they are not ready for and that they don't want. 12% in a 7-day period report violent content. And eSafety in Australia also does these kinds of studies. They report that 47% of youth had seen a fight video online, 34% in the last 12 months. And again, so 10 to 50%, it's not an uncommon experience. It's a high scale experience. And you see these differ by platform. So this is actually a study we did of adults. And so we found that users on, so the left is negative experiences by platform. And you'll see that Twitter and Nextdoor, people report more negative experiences than they do on, say, YouTube or on text messaging or email. It's often useful to compare to email and text messaging as like neutral platforms, right? So, why do some platforms have a lot more unwanted experiences than, say, text messaging or than email? So you see that like Twitter has more negative experiences than, say, YouTube. But then if you look at where are people learning new things, you might say, oh, well, it's because they're getting exposed to new content that always has a risk. But people are actually learning more on YouTube than they are on Twitter, right? So different platforms have different experiences, and it's all based on their design to some degree. And if you actually look at the what Twitter and YouTube say about their algorithms, you can actually see, Twitter is actually open source to their credit, their algorithm occasionally. And you can see that they are clearly optimized for engagement, whereas YouTube often talks about how they use surveys. And I'll talk a little bit more about that design choice. Excessive usage. So there's a Pew study, 45% of teens say that they spend too much time on social media. So that, again, is not us saying that you teens are spending too much time on social media, but is they themselves saying, I spend too much time on social media. So, and if I do talks in classrooms periodically, and I'll ask kids, how many of you want to spend less time on their phones? I'll do this with adults too. And almost every audience I talk to, kids or adults, about 3/4 of the audience will raise their hand. So there's a lot of people there who, are spending more time than they want on these platforms. And teens will tell you that it affects their sleep, it affects their productivity, right? And so those are the numbers on the right. And this again differs by platform. So with collaborators, I do some advisory role with the Anxious Generation Group, and so they did this survey about what platforms do teens regret the existence of, right? I wish this platform had never been invented. And you'll see that, Twitter, TikTok, Snapchat, Instagram, they have relatively high levels of I wish these things had never been invented, as compared to a platform like YouTube, which has more passive consumption. A lot of people access it, they search for something, they read it, and then they move on with their lives, right? So they're just designed very differently. Instagram and Snapchat and TikTok are sort of designed to suck you in, whereas there are platforms that are more, passive consumption, like I search for a thing and I read it. And that design choice has a very different effect on users' feelings of regretted usage of those platforms. So just made the argument that these harms are widespread. These harms differ by platform. I'm going to talk a little bit about design, but I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically by what we know about platform design. And I'll tell you a little bit about my time. So it was mentioned that I worked at Meta for a period of time. I worked on moderation issues as a data science manager and newsfeed integrity. I eventually moved to research because the harms that users were reporting were actually not always captured by our policy. So we were counting things that violated our bullying and harassment policy. But if a user says to another user, nice sweater, like you can't actually tell if that's bullying and harassment or not, and certainly wouldn't violate a policy. unless you know something about the history of those two individuals, right? So I moved to research where I could understand, I could ask users like, what are you feeling is harmful? And then eventually, a lot of the things we ended up doing that were effective were more in the realm of design, and I was ended up my time there as a product manager. Um, and I'll give you. I used to show this slide on internally, and just talking about how you know harm is really much more than about content, right? I use the example of someone saying "nice sweater" to someone else, and to judge if that's harmful, you need to know something about who's saying it, the audience. You need to know something about the historical context between them. And so, if a lot of policies deal really just with the message, but really, if you understand harm, it's really about much more than the message. And that's why, moderation was never particularly effective at really reducing user harm. And certainly, we should have some amount of moderation. But if you focus too much on moderation, you often get issues of bias and censorship. So this is actually an older article from an audit done during like a previous cycle of violence in the Middle East, really just showing that if you start trying to lean into moderation, you're going to end up censoring people, especially in environments where they're talking about things in very charged ways. And so, again, you have access to the slides. This is an internal article written at Meta about, in the context, especially of like health content, that there's often harmful, non-violating content that needs to be addressed and that is not addressable through moderation. In the health context, it's often, if someone wants to say something misleading about health, they'll often tell a personal story. They'll often ask a question. And so those kinds of things are not, we want people to be able to ask questions. People should be able to ask questions. People should be able to tell stories. So, enforcing on that kind of content is not, I think it's appropriate. And I also don't think it's particularly effective. It's going to lead to a backlash, as we've seen. Rather, I think you need to ask the question, why do some of these things, small groups of people who are highly motivated, pushing certain narratives, why is that effective? Like, what is about the design of these systems that allows small groups of people to dominate against, sort of a larger group of people? So, we often work more on design. Again, it's less subjective, it's less prone to abuse, it's more legitimate and defensible, both legally and politically, right? It's not like someone, whether it's at a company or someone in government, saying what people can and can't say. And it's also more effective because it can get at that borderline content, people asking questions, people cherry picking a true instance of something happening and representing it as more widespread. Because oftentimes this borderline content, it's not the existence of it that's the problem. It's the spread of it. It's the fact that small groups of people can use it to dominate a conversation. And so some of the things we did at Meta is, we reformed our engagement incentives. Again, you have access to the slides, so I might go a little quicker here just for time reasons, but, we would reduce engagement incentives, give people less content that gets people to comment back and forth, less things that people are resharing, and that measurably reduced the amount of anger reactions, the amount of bullying, the amount of misleading information, the amount of graphic violence. And in surveys, people actually said that that content was more worth their time as a result of removing those engagement incentives. And you may think, like, well, you need to, surface content based on something. And so what we'd have to do is we'd survey users. So on the left, this is a survey we would do in the comment space. You can, if you're saying which comment should be at the top of a thread, discussing an article, you could rank based on which comments get the most likes or the most comments, right? But oftentimes, if I were to say, F you politician, in the comments, I might get lots of likes from people who agree with me. I might get comments from people who disagree with me. I'll get some amount of engagement, but people don't really think that's a high quality comment. Whereas if I survey users and I ask them, what do you think is a high quality comment? And I use that to predict like what looks like a high quality comment, I get a very different answer. Nobody thinks "F you politician" is a great comment, even if they will engage with it, right? And so we do these surveys and rank based on surveys. We might add more explicit feedback. So we like put an X in the upper right of posts and say like, okay, tell us things that you dislike, and you can hide them and make just a little bit easier. Or we might actually ask you in the feed, like, do you want to see more or less posts like this, right? So ways that we can sort of improve the user experience by getting more of that explicit feedback, not just what do I pay attention to, but what do I actually say that I want. And then we do functionality limiting, so more privacy with like things like lock profile, limits on how much you can forward something. Not that you can't forward something, but just adding a little bit of friction to the process so that you have to copy and paste it. Yeah, so we've taken some of these recommendations, we put it into a design code for social media. Since I left Meta about 3 years ago, we've talked to people at other platforms, Pinterest, has actually authored some articles about their experience of this and how they optimize for explicit user feedback instead of just optimizing for what people pay attention to. And across platforms, people do the same things, these kinds of ways to give people more control, replace engagement optimization, rate limits, privacy defaults, ways to empower users, have less ability for users to, small groups of users to manipulate others, and improve outcomes both for kids and for the information space. And we've mapped these. And so again, you have access to the slides. You can see we have a whole taxonomy of all these design features and then how they map to these specific columns. So, I've talked a little bit about engagement-based systems. And, you'll often hear companies talk about they just give people what they want. But just to put a point on it a little bit further, you can optimize the system for various kinds of things, right? So on the bottom are various ingredients that you can use in an algorithm. You can optimize for things that people spend more time viewing. You can optimize for things that people spend more time clicking on, and you can observe, what do people spend more time viewing, what do people spend more time clicking on, or you can ask people what they want, right? You can survey them. What is it you aspire to consume? What did you find more informative? Or you can put it out in the UI. What do I want to make a love reaction on, right? And so you have these two kinds of wants, right? You have wants based on your observed behavior, and these are, oftentimes we often call this revealed preference. And if you observe my behavior, you might notice that I'm with my kids and I'm on my phone, or I'm watching like relatively trashy TV, or I'm eating an unhealthy food, right? Like to some degree, I want a donut, right? But I don't aspire to eat more donuts. I aspire to eat healthier food. So if you ask me, if you survey me, or look for my expressed aspirations, my stated preference, not my revealed preference, I will tell you that I want to eat healthier food. I want to spend less time on my phone, and I want to play with my kids. I want to pay more attention to them. I want to, consume, healthier information, more informative things. I want to watch documentaries, right? So oftentimes our expressed aspirations and our observed behavior are not the same thing. And companies often conflate these two things, right? They give people what they want in the short term, not what they want in the long term, not what they aspire to in the long term. And so a lot of our recommendations really sort of aim to move these things into the longer term. And a lot of the design choices we argue for, and again, you have access to the slides, you can see these links, are based on that. How do we give users the power to understand, to control their experiences online and fulfill their aspirations, as opposed to having platforms that try to get them to use these platforms more and sort of take up their attention and maybe serve their more like, what they want in the more, I want to eat a donut sense, right? So there are all these design choices that platforms do, whether they have negative feedback as a top level action, right? You can downvote things on YouTube and on Twitter and on Reddit. You can't do that on Twitter. Whether a platform encourages logged up access. So we did a study over a 2-year period. Reddit has really been leaning into logged off access without an account. And so more and more users are using Reddit, getting there by search, like they're searching for a place to park at a concert or a very specific piece of information. They read something on Reddit and they move on with their life. If they're using it as a tool, they're not using it as something that they're locked into. Right? And so just the encouragement of that, that use of your platform as a tool, as opposed to like something that tries to lock you in, increase their percentage of informative experiences by 70%. And then also, like, we think for kids, you see these stories about sextortion, right? Which is where an attractive stranger will come to, will message a child, pretend to want to start a relationship with them. A child doesn't know any better, maybe sends them a picture of themselves in a compromising position. And then that person starts to extort them by threatening to send that information to others. And we've actually seen descriptions of that playbook. And it often starts with mass invitations and then screenshots of the victim's network, right? And so if you just disable mass invitations and you disable visibility of other people's networks, then you can short circuit those attacks. So these are some of the design choices that can be done. And there are policies now that are addressing these kinds of harmful designs. So in New York and California in the United States, they've passed addictive feed laws. And these have actually been upheld recently by the courts. So it's a content neutral way, right? You're not saying like what people can and can't say online or see online. You're just saying we don't want algorithms that are optimized to keep kids online longer and longer. We actually want them to actually have to seek out information and read the thing that they want to read, as opposed to just mindlessly scrolling through things. So that's in California, New York. You can also, if you think of a system as like it creates some amount of temptation, and then there's some amount of willpower that you can use to resist that temptation. So there are parts of the system that increase temptation, like addictive feeds, and there are parts of the system that sort of reduce your ability to exercise willpower by reducing the amount of friction. So things like infinite scroll and autoplay. So reduce that opportunity for you to say, look, I want to stop watching this, right? Because the next video just plays automatically. So you're not actually asking yourself, like, do I want to keep spending my time in this way? Or infinite scroll does the same thing, right? Like you get to an end of a set of content, and instead of there being an end, it just keeps going. But if you actually stopped and had to click like next, maybe you would actually decide, you know what, I spent enough time consuming this content. I'll do something else. Um, uh, there's also increasing privacy, and a lot of these are, things that are increasingly being adopted by the DSA and Ofcom as well. They have more general, concepts about systemic risk that are sort of being boiled down to these very specific principles of like, okay, what does that really mean? It means increased privacy, it means increased friction, it means differences in these algorithms. So those are some of the kinds of laws that are increasingly spreading worldwide. Obviously the problem still exists. I'm not going to argue that they've been solved by these policies, but I do think we're moving in a direction. If you read the laws in the United States and you read what the DSA is saying about kids, they all rhyme with each other. It's all about the same kinds of designs that we are all saying, these are not helpful for kids. And then the last policy I want to mention is distraction-free school. So, one thing that actually has changed. So a lot of these design-based changes haven't gone into effect, right? The platforms are still negotiating around the DSA. A lot of these battles are still playing out in the courts, right? The laws have been passed, but we're still not seeing some of the tangible benefits online. Distraction-free schools, we're actually seeing these a qualitatively different experience in many schools, where schools are, saying like, you can't have phones in schools anymore. At least during the hours of 9 and 3 p.m. Take a break. And the light green here are states that have passed bell to bell. You can't use it at any point during the day at school. The dark green are states, U.S. states that have passed partial. They passed just during class time policy, but something that's not quite bell to bell. And you'll see most states have enacted some kind of phone-free school law, and that's in part because the early returns, when like some districts have done it, they've seen less fighting, they've seen more chatter in the hallways. They've seen less distraction. The teachers are happier because they're not fighting the kids about like getting off their phones. So it's just been a great experience, and we're seeing a lot more positive change there. Um, so I just want to end like on a somewhat optimistic note and just say that, it may seem at times like things aren't getting better. And, you go to a mall and there's a bunch of kids, and instead of talking to each other, they're all on their phones. You're like, okay, this is not what we want in the world. And we see like, violence being fomented online. We see all sorts of things that indicate that like, we haven't solved this problem. But I'd just like to, put it in perspective of how, we first got cars mass produced in the early 1900s. And we didn't get seatbelts until the 60s, right? Like people had to actually advocate. And I wasn't alive then, but, I read the stories of, Ralph Nader, talking about how, we need consumer safety for cars. And now we have seatbelts, we have airbags, we have all sorts of safety standards. Car companies are still able to make cars. People are still able to benefit from cars, but they're just safer, right? And it took a while. And so Facebook first opened to the public in 2006. And so, it's just a process, and we're starting to understand more about the physics of social media, right? Some of these things I mentioned are these break the glass tools have been done in, elections around the world. And so they're understood. Like these are ways that you stop small groups of people, whether affecting kids or elections, from affecting large groups of people, right? So we're understanding more about the physics of social media. And we can start to apply this not just to social media, but we can also apply it to everything that's coming, that where people, whether it's video games that, are no longer about like I pay $40 and play a game, but they're trying to get to, play it more so you buy more things, or it's AI chatbots to try to keep you on by being your friend and creating a sense of intimacy, or whether it's online gambling platforms to try to send you the right bet at the right time, to get you to gamble a little bit more. Like, all technical progress is not innovation. Trying to get people to use things more through technology is not necessarily what we want these technology products to be doing. And as they generate externalities, we can fight against them just like we did. People shouldn't be able to selling you cheaper cars or selling you cheaper food or unsafe food to get you to buy those products more. And we shouldn't be putting up with it in the technology domain just the same. So that's my talk. And yeah, happy to take questions, and appreciate your attention.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.